one of the things we wanted to address here during our lunch program is the context of who we are and what we're doing. And that's really looking at building in suburban America. The great challenge that we have is, as we said earlier, is enforcing our codes and yet still giving residents the confidence that we're serving them. And that's hard to do when you're challenging things that they may have done with their property, that their predecessor might have done to the property. It costs people money, it costs people time. It's such a great difficulty. There were certainly some important questions. I know one of the questions about, do our guys look at the laws, and are there differences with laws or interpretations of laws, and how do we engage with that? That's something we do need to continue to discuss. How we treat things on the front end and the back end is one of the great challenges. What happens when we find something on the back end that got through us on the front end, especially if the building's been built? We don't want to have to give people notice after notice after notice, letter after letter. That's one of the greatest frustrations that people have. We hear people on that. We understand that. We need to get to a better place and yet still fulfill our mission. So now let's focus and turn to building in Suburbia. I'm going to bring up first Larry Levy, who's the director of the National Center for Suburban Studies at Hofstra University. Larry is a former reporter at Newsday and former editor. He has been following issues involving local municipalities for decades, and is really has been and now is still a very strong voice for what we're doing within our communities here on Long Island. And that analysis is a constant analysis that Hofstra is pursuing, and so we welcome Larry Levy from Suburban Studies at Hofstra.
I'm gonna sit. Can someone turn this mic on?
Is it on?
Or should I turn this mic on? I think I've got it.
Yeah, you gotta hold it right to your mouth.
I gotta hold it to my mouth. Thank you for having me. I do speak a lot. I had a television show for 14 years on PBS, and I've probably appeared before every civic group in suburban America, even beyond here. But anytime I'm in a room filled with people who actually know what they're doing and know what they're talking about, I actually get a little bit nervous. So bear with me as I warm up into this. And just a quick second, the National Center for Suburban Studies is it's a nonpartisan research institute with a national focus on the suburbs. We use Long Island in a sense as a laboratory for investigating and exploring all the challenges that you face in your everyday life just as citizens. And in areas that are more relevant to what you do, we're involved with projects. We are a sub-consultant to Jacobs Engineering, which is a Pasadena-based firm on the hub transportation alternatives analysis. We were one of the sub-consultants to Arab Partners, which is based in London, for the Long Island 2035 study, and for Parsons Brinkerhoff for a study on where and how to build infill housing near train stations. I also want to say this is an extraordinary event, and if I could put my old, political columnist hat on, I can recall in my 30 years, 7 months, and 14 days at Newsday, and my 4+ years at Hofstra, I can recall only one event like this that involved really nitty-gritty technical issues where this many people came together for this long, were actually this quiet, listening to people. And it was a sewer conference that Steve Levy put on that I thought about 10 people would come to, and 500 showed up. But that was a county-wide event, and this is just a town-wide event. So I think that per capita, this has to be the most extraordinary conference of its kind I've ever been to. So you're doing great work. And that says something about not only the town, but the people who work here. This is not your mother and father's suburbs anymore. When my parents packed up their Conestoga wagon and lit out across the 59th Street Bridge with the wagon train, they stopped off at a place called Valley Stream back in the early 50s in a neighborhood that was absolutely brand new. The asphalt was pristine. You could have used it as a putting green. The houses were newly built and well built. The sewers underneath them were almost new. The air was clean. The streets were free of the criminal element that they all left New York City for. They had, it was a great, and the schools were absolutely brand new. When we moved in, they were still putting the finishing touches on the Forest Road Elementary School. It's changed. Long Island still is a wonderful place to live, but we have an enormous number of challenges. And it's not just Long Island, but it's suburban America writ large. Now, 55% of the people in the country live in the suburbs. It's suburban voters who will decide who wins the presidency, as they have for the last 6 presidential cycles, and will determine which party controls Congress. Now, more than half the poor people in the country live in suburban communities. More than half of the new immigrants, wealthy, rich and poor, are living in suburban communities. And instead of in my grandparents' generation, when people moved to the cities to acculturate for a generation or two and then lit out for the suburbs, they're coming directly from their home countries to realize the American, the suburban dream. We're also struggling with crumbling infrastructure. Again, even some of the best of communities. How do we deal with solid waste and liquid waste? And what do we do about the aging of suburbia, the drain of some sectors of our young people? What do we do about poverty? How do we house poor people? How do we serve them? All these challenges, for really the first time, are front and center in suburban America, and many towns and villages and counties, even well-meaning ones, don't have a clue. These changes have ramifications and consequences for town services, to bring it home, including the building department. And I'll just run through a few and then relinquish the mic. Aging housing stock. Again, my parents' home, the home I grew up in, was built in 1954 or 5. It's now real old. It needs to be retrofitted. It probably has been retrofitted more than once. But within 20 years, almost every house on Long Island is going to be, in one way or another, almost rebuilt from the bottom up. And that creates tremendous opportunities, but it also creates tremendous challenges for contractors and architects, for researchers who are trying to produce new products, and of course for building departments and the politicians who run them, the elected officials. Sometimes people think politicians is a dirty word. I don't. The aging population, the aging of suburbia. In addition to aging housing stock, we have an aging population. My mother and father are, well, my father's gone, but my mother's 96. And her world is a little bit different and requires, even though she still lives by herself, requires major changes. And you folks who are in the building industry and people who are here to protect them have a new set of challenges. The aging population also means complications in dealing with more than one generation. You might be dealing with children who want things done a certain way. You can't just deal with their parents. Also, you're dealing with people with who may be diminishing in capacity, and that changes your responsibility ethically as well as economically. The need for higher density. Suburban communities are building out all over the country. The only place you can go if you want to grow is up. You need to get denser. You don't have to, but if you want to grow, that's what you've got to do. And that means that building departments that specialized in one-family homes, codes that were, and processes that were based on that premise are going to have to change. And higher density is not just to retain our young people, but that's very, very important. People are moving to Brooklyn and Queens because they want to live with other young people, and they want to live in exciting, walkable, playable, workable communities. Again, I'm not making a pitch to rezone all your downtowns, but some of you will do that. because you will recognize that if you want to grow, that's what you will have to do. And then the new immigrants. I believe firmly, if I could just put a little ideology and personal belief, that the new immigrants are the key to our social and economic survival. New immigrant populations almost single-handedly have propped up the real estate markets in middle class and wealthy communities alike over the last 4 or 5 years of the downturn. They are revitalizing neighborhoods. They are taking jobs not just as kitchen helpers, but as heart surgeons. They are our future, but they may come from places that just did business a little differently. They may have different expectations. There may be language issues. And these are things that you're going to have to come to grips with. You need a system in the end that is ethical, efficient, and responsive to the needs of property owners and business people. But you also need to come up with one that protects people. And I'll just close with a thought. I still can smell the fire that I covered in Huntington in a substandard building that should never have housed anybody, certainly not as many people as they were, where a couple of Salvadoran immigrants died. And the story was framed mostly in the terms of the undocumented trying to make their way. But when it comes down to it, like the fire in Connecticut, it was a codes issue. So what you're doing now is not just about being able to make a buck honestly and efficiently, but it's also about saving lives. And better you have to do this than me. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. I would note that this conversation really did start years ago, and we had met with folks from the American Institute of Architects in about 2008, I believe, and brought a number of them into town hall and our building department to start giving us some guidance as to how to best navigate some of these plans that we were getting and start this process. And then there was a gap in terms of our relationship with them, and that started up again recently at the end of last year. But in the middle of last year, during the summer, Mitch Pally had reached out to us with some other folks from the contractors and building trades perspective, and said that, of course, they were suffering and there was a lot of challenges that they were facing, and North Hempstead was a very challenging place to do business. And my response has always been, well, part of our job is to make it challenging to build here. The residents make it very clear they don't want unfettered access to construct things. They want limitations and rules and things that not only make houses safe, but also limit density and other things such as that. So it's a constant battle to go back and forth. How do you grow a community? How do you provide proper construction? And yet we've learned that the people that build are the people that reinvigorate a community. When you build a new building, a new commercial site, you're cleaning up the old property, you're getting rid of contamination, you're putting in new landscaping. In many respects, you're improving the community. So long as you're part of the solution, not part of the problem, the community will welcome you, if not at first, over time. And so that is one of the great challenges that the construction and building industry has. And so I'll ask Mitch, who is the CEO of the Long Island Builders Institute, Levy, who have been part of our discussions over the last few months, as indicated, to come and make the next presentation. Mitch Pally. And Mitch, while you're turning on your mic, just one other thing. We did get a question about the numbers before, and the answer really is, as indicated in our sheet here, there's 8,342 building permits and CEOs that were issued. And so the question is, well, how many applications do you get during the course of the year? And I suppose the question is, are we providing more permits than we're getting in, or are we meeting that number? So we had about 2,000 applications to us in the last 3 months, as indicated by one of the panelists, a little over 2,000. And so what's happening is, if we're going to get between 8,000 and 9,000, and we're issuing between 8,000 and 9,000, we will be on track. Of course, there was a backlog, and that's that backlog that we're still struggling with in many respects, but that's being narrowed, and we'll continue to dedicate the resources to do that. So I think it's a good sign in terms of just the sheer volume, and we'll get more information to you as well. All right, Mitch.
Thank you, John. Is this on now?
Yeah, just speak, you gotta speak right into it.
Hello? Okay. Thank you very much, and Libby wants to thank John and the members of the town board of the town of North Hempstead for giving us the opportunity to participate over the last 6 months.
Mitch, I would just say hold it on this.
Okay. I thought I was actually coming here in my other role as a member of the board of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, and would get all your support for reinstituting half-hour service on the Fort Washington branch, right? Everybody like that, right? At least we did something right. Huh? If we can't reduce your fares, at least we can give you more service. So starting May 14th, you get half-hour service back. I think that's the first time I ever got a clap in 8 years on the MTA board. It happens every once in a while. No, it happened again because we're giving free Metro cards to all the seniors in the city who are part of our paratransit program. We finally figured out that it's easier to give them free Metro cards than it is to collect their money. It's less expensive to do it that way, and so that's what we're going to start to do next year. But be that as it may, that's a whole different tangent. I also wanted to thank the town because I always love coming back to Harbor Hills. I'm sorry?
Harbor Links.
Harbor Links, I'm sorry. Harbor Links, in that regard, because I started my career across the street. Across the street, of course, is Bar Beach, or what I guess used to be known as Bar Beach. And that was the first place I ever had a job. When I was 15 years old, I was the boat ramp attendant at Bar Beach to make sure that nobody had their boat at the ramp more than 15 minutes. It was easy to tell them you had to move it. It was much harder to get them to move it in that regard. But that's how we, everybody has that story about where they started. I started at Bar Beach. It was a great opportunity. I just want to follow up on a couple of things that Larry said, and Larry is clearly an expert in the changing demographics of Long Island. But from a real estate development perspective, and I represent the home builders on Long Island, the change in the demographics of the island and its effect on lifestyles, on communities, and everything that goes with it is really the main focus of the building industry as we go forward. Because the era of the single-family home in most places on Long Island has finished. Partially because there's very little land left to do that, but also because there's very little demand for it. The changing demographics, the significant increase in single-parent households, the significant increase for those of you who want to read something that, if you ever want to read numbers, and my wife is a statistics teacher, and she'll tell you, okay, which side of the argument you want to be on, I'll give you numbers for it. But if you want to read something very interesting on Long Island, read the census numbers. Not just the numbers, but the background information behind the numbers. With the significant increase in single-family parent homes, with the significant increase on Long Island, over 150% in the last 10 years of people living alone on Long Island. Now, they're either living in their own apartment, or people like my wife and myself are living in our big 5-bedroom house in Stony Brook, and all the kids are gone. It's me, my wife, and the dog, and I know where I rate on that hierarchy in that regard, and I'm always told that, but that's okay. But that's the new lifestyle for many Long Islanders. The kids have gone. Young people are not moving into the community. Many of our young people are leaving, and it's our question as to how the building industry meets that new demand without threatening the lifestyle that many people still want to have on Long Island, which is the single-family home. How do we make both of them work for Long Island in the places where they are supposed to work without each side feeling that the other side is the enemy? Because that's really the question that comes out. And I always think about, my mother, after my father died, sold her big house in Searingtown where we grew up, and moved to North Shore Towers. Now, North Shore Towers has 20,000 people living in it. And what would happen, where would those 20,000 people be, or what would have happened if they had tried to build that 150 yards to the east? Because 150 yards to the east is no longer New York City, it's Nassau County. And I guess it's the village of Lake Success and everything else that goes along with that. To those 20,000 people, because my mother has lived there for over 30 years, North Shore Towers is the best thing ever built. They have their own community, they have their own shopping center downstairs, they have their own restaurants, they have everything that most people who don't go to North Shore Towers as much as I do, although my mother will clearly tell me not enough, but that's beside the point, has downstairs. If you go downstairs, they have their own athletic facility and their own shopping center and their own doctors and their own dentists and everything. It's a little community of its own with 3 big towers. And most people would say, who don't like that the community is great except we don't like the towers. But to them, the towers make the community. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad, but for those people who live there, it is a panacea. And what has happened now, for those of us who have been visiting for 30 years, is as people who were original buyers or have been buyers over the period of time have died, and that's what happens, as we all know, young people are starting to move into that community, where you now see strollers you never saw before. And the question is, that we understand is a New York City phenomenon, but in this case, it's a New York City phenomenon by 150 yards. And the question is, how does Suburbia affect that? Or how does it affect Suburbia? To most young people today, the city is the place to be. Except we all left the city. Now they're all going back to the city. 2 of my kids live in the city. 2 of my other kids live in Boston, because we all know once they go to Boston, they never come home in that regard. But they now live in the city. It was a funny thing. I went to the Knicks game last week, and I had a little time to spend. I was walking around the sidewalk about 6:30, and I must have gone past 5,000 people, and I was absolutely convinced I was the oldest person walking, without a doubt, because all you see there are young people, and I will bet you half of those young people come from families on Long Island, because it's an amazing coincidence that the grandparents and the parents came here, and the children grew up here and now moved back. And how does that affect us, all of whom have families? How does it affect the town of North Hempstead and all of the other municipalities on Long Island that try to fashion a relationship between the way it is, or the way it was and the way it is, and the way new people want it to be, with the type of housing, with the building codes, with the ability for transportation that is far different than it is today in that regard. That is really going to be the question that Long Island is facing now, as we have the highest decline of people between the ages of 18 and 35 of any suburban area in the country. And sooner or later, that is going to affect our ability to attract businesses here for whom everybody wants to work, because we all understand, number one, it's good for them, and number two, it's good for the school districts because they produce tax revenues with no kids. In that regard, that's going to be the threshold of how Long Island does it. Conferences like this are great opportunities to think about those type of things, because it's not just the building code itself, it's the rationale behind the building code by the villages and the town and the county that is going to play a large role in where Long Island is going to go both in the short term, but even more importantly in the long term. On behalf of Levy, we very much appreciate the opportunity to participate in this panel and all other options. You know, from our perspective, our members are looking for transparency. What can they do before they do it? Because knowing what you can do before you do it is a lot better than being told you can't do this after you did it. And so that goal is, I think, a very important opportunity for this conference to try to do. Thank you, John, very much. And just remember half-hour service.
Half-hour service. Thanks for the MTA. Next, we're going to have Anthony Properzio, who's the Vice President of the Long Island chapter of the American Institute of Architects. And you've heard that organization quite a bit today. They've been very engaged with us, as the Liborg and real estate folks, and again, the contractors. It really is a wonderful discussion. The discussion, by the way, evolves even to the green technology. The future is how do we save energy? How do we build consistent with our standards so we reduce costs of operating a home or a business, and we do that through green technology. The town has changed our codes. We've worked with other towns throughout Long Island, some who are represented here, to meet needs, standardize ways we do things, which would be a good idea. We talked about licenses. We issued hundreds of plumbing licenses and electrical licenses. We have arrangements with other towns so that we recognize theirs and they recognize ours. But again, maybe there should be a larger or a county or Long Island type of license procedure. These are types of things that we need to continue to discuss. But to try to give a global perspective of the architectural industry, again, is Anthony Properzio. How do you say that, Anthony? I'm going to get that right. Properzio. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to stand because being of Italian descent, I use my hands a lot, and I didn't want to send Larry home with a black eye. I would also like to thank my fellow architects for coming here today and attending this presentation. For those of you who want to know who the architects in the office, in the audience are, they're easily identifiable. They're the only ones that are actually squeezing the little yellow helmets. And given the topic of discussion today, some of them are hyperventilating. But I'd like to give you an idea of what building in Suburbia is like from the architectural side of the industry. Personally, start out thinking about architecture probably in high school, mid-years. And in my case, at that time, The Fountainhead was the great romantic novel that actually romanticized the profession, studying the ancient architectural histories of our civilizations, and in modern times, probably romanticized by George Costanza, most recently. But we all had this great perception that we were going to be great designers, and that being that architecture was considered part of the art community, that we would be able to go out and transform landscapes and skyscapes and to really have an effect on society and the impact that building and good design has. Shortly after graduating college, we start to realize that we're not totally in the art realm, in that we're not given a blank canvas to work with and the freedom to create whatever painting we would like, or music or poetry, that there are certain parameters that come into play that even start to shape the work that we're beginning to develop before we even put a pencil on the paper, and that's the codes and building regulations that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. At the turn of the century, the zoning and building codes were very modest, very few pages of ordinances because of the lack of density. Everything was spread out so far. Buildings were basically low-rise, one-story and in some cases 2 or 3 story structures, so that the requirements and the regulations weren't as critical as they became later on. Post World War II was when especially Long Island started to see great diversity and more development coming in, most commonly the Levittown improvement in 1947. And then as the island started to grow, we all know the influence of the Long Island Railroad on Long Island, basically probably the major contributor for development on Long Island, that small towns start to crop up along the railroad tracks that had developed through the Long Island Railroad. Excuse me. So as an architect, we're now into an area where we have to establish what the rules are and what the parameters of the ordinances are before we could even start to design. Just to give you an idea on, forgive me if I'm babbling a little bit. I rewrote this 3 times since I got here this morning because everything was so exacting before we got the answers and questions that were given knocked off half of the things that I planned on discussing. But as an architect practicing on Long Island, in Nassau County we have 5 towns, 66 incorporated villages, and 1 city, being Long Beach. In Suffolk County there are 10 towns, 10 villages, and 1 city.
We have 3 towns and 2 cities.
3 towns and 2 cities. Glencoe. So we have a total of 93 separate zoning ordinances. Each of those municipalities has their own zoning ordinance. We all fall under the same building code, but each zoning ordinance is different. So it's quite complex and it gets quite confusing sometimes, practicing from one area to another to the other. Sometimes we cross information and a code interpretation that you might have gotten in one community might be different than the other. As was already mentioned today, luckily we deal with one set of building codes outside of New York City, the New York State Building Code, but that in itself has 9 volumes or sections to it. The Building Code of New York State, which basically deals with everything other than a 1, 2, or 3 family dwelling, the Residential Code, Energy Conservation Code, Mechanical Code, Fuel Gas Code, Plumbing Code, Fire Code, Existing Building Code, and Property Maintenance Code. In addition to those, we have thousands of different memoranda, directives, interpretations as we go throughout the practice of architecture on Long Island. So I think I would just like everyone to kind of appreciate the fact of what we have to do. When we say we have to initially research a project, this is what we're going through. Client expectations. Inevitably, every client that walks into our office has an expectation, and probably even more so than the actual project itself, their primary concern is time. How fast can you get this? Can I start building? That's probably the first question most architects get asked of a client coming in for the first consultation. And of course, from what we heard today, we know that that answer varies from municipality to municipality. Certain incorporated villages may only have 1 person serving as planning examiner inspector. It's a small community, so the turnover time generally is probably pretty quick, whereas with the larger municipalities, more people, more permits, more applications coming in, maybe less personnel to deal with those issues, the time takes a lot more. We spoke about the issue of maintains. For those of you who are not familiar with the term maintains, what we're talking about are conditions within a building for which the building department or the municipality has no record of. Okay, so it's normally a maintain is to file a plan or to legalize some work which was done without the benefit of a filing, approval, or a building permit. And I think one of the most difficult issues that we deal with clients that come in with maintain type applications, probably the most common comment that we get as architects is, but this is the way I bought the house. When I bought the house 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it had a finished basement. It had a bathroom in the basement. There was a dormer, or there was a fence, whatever the case may be. And while that may be true, it doesn't mitigate the fact that at one point in time, that work was necessary to be filed, it was required to be filed, to obtain a permit, and to get the final paperwork and certificates that were required at the time. So that it becomes very difficult for us, and I can't tell you how many commissions I probably lost in my professional experience by telling people up front what the problems are. It almost gets to the point where you scare them off. They don't want to hear the ramifications that might come with the difficulty of filing a maintaining application. It could be a simple rear deck, and the railing, as we investigate, we find does not comply with the regulations of what the building code requires today. So you tell the homeowner you're going to have to take down the railing, or you have to reconstruct it, or you're going to have to modify it in some way, shape, form, as we can find the easiest way to modify it in order to comply with the code. Other people might tell them, might not recognize the problem and just file an application, and then they get hit with a lot of comments from the building department where they itemize all of the issues that don't comply with the building code. So it's very important. In the handout that you got from the town today in this Working to Serve You Better, I don't want to self-promote it, but there's an article in there that was written through the Long Island chapter of AIA, the Architects Association. It's titled Buying and Selling Your Home. And I would suggest it's not exciting reading, but it's worthwhile, and it gives you an idea of what you should be looking at in terms of researching things. Work without permits. Another issue that we deal with. We do a plan for people. They don't retain us to file with the building department or whatever the case might be, and we find out that the work is done without a permit. Why do people do work without filing for a permit? Probably the number one cause, and I think it's one of the reasons why we're here today, is because when the approval process becomes so difficult and so time-consuming, and people are confronted with the urgency of the project that they would like to have completed, they make a decision to say, you know what, I'm going to do it, and when I get caught, I'll worry about it. And that's the number one reason. Number two reason is they think they're going to save thousands of dollars, well, it might be true in some cases, of taxes each year. And the only thing I could say to both of those circumstances is that it's probably the dumbest thing that you possibly could do. Because I think, and it'll be bared out by probably many people, some of which might be in the room today, that instead of filing today and dealing with the problems and going through the system and doing it the right way, you're risking the chance of being picked up later on down the road. And there is a possibility that there might be a code change between now and that time. And the work that you may be performing today, even though it might comply with today's standards, may no longer comply because of a change in the code. So maintains and works without permits are extremely difficult, and it's one of the toughest elements that we have to deal with in architecture. A lady before mentioned the word grandfathering, and I'd just like to say it's kind of off, but for some reason I find, I'm also a part-time building official, and when we run into circumstances where we pick up things that work was done without a permit, or things were altered, or built not according to the approved plans, whatever the case may be, someone will ultimately come up to us and say, but that's grandfathered. And I try to explain as best I can, like, grandfathering doesn't mean you did it without a permit, but because you didn't get caught for 10 years, that doesn't now make it legal. Okay, grandfathering means at the time it was built, it was done legally according to the laws and regulations that were in effect at that time, but because of some modification, revision, or change to the law since that time, it's no longer permitted, but it's allowed to continue to be used as a non-conforming use. I'd just like to end with a real appreciation and a heartfelt thanks to Supervisor Kaiman. The Long Island chapter of the American Institute of Architects have been speaking with the town for quite a while now. We have a great communication going. Some of the things that you heard today, some of the positives that came out of today's conference were a result of the communications that have taken place over the past 6 or 8 months. And I think this is one of the greatest things that happened to the practice of architecture within the town of North Hempstead, is that we now have this open dialogue, not only at the supervisor's level, but the commissioner, building department's level, throughout the town. And it's very unusual, and I'd just like to thank the superintendent for the opportunity he's given us. Thank you.
And our last speaker comes from the contracting world, and you know, Anthony had said, you know, why do people not get permits? And one of the questions is because of all our processes, maybe it takes a long time. But there, you know, there's a quick story where one gentleman comes to the town and he says, you know, you're not giving me my permit for my sunroom, and what's going on? So I say, sit down for a second, let me talk to you. And we had some of our building officials there. We said, listen, how many bathrooms do you have in your house? And he didn't want to answer. I said, listen, we know how many bathrooms you have in your house, but just for fun, just tell us how many bathrooms you have in your house. He said, well, I have 3 bathrooms. I said, right. Now, how many bathrooms do your plans say that you have? And he looks at the plans. He said, well, it says they have 1. I said, you know, so that's kind of a problem for us. I said, but let me ask you something. Where are the other 2 bathrooms? He said, I said, come on, you can tell us. Just tell us where the other 2 bathrooms are. The other 2 bathrooms are on the 2nd floor. I said, look at your plans. How many floors does your house have? He said, it's a 1-story house. I said, how did you do this? He goes, it happened like 7, 8, 9 years ago. We built this. I said, well, why did you do it that way? He says, well, my contractor said it'd be cheaper if we didn't tell the town and we just built the whole 2nd floor without telling the town. And of course, he was right. It's cheaper if you don't tell us. You don't pay the permit fees. You don't have to hire licensed contractors. You don't have to have a licensed plumber or a licensed architect, and you don't have to pay the taxes on the addition. And so, yes, it is cheaper, unless, of course, you get caught, and now the process gets delayed for months, unless you have other issues that create different problems, unless you have a fire or some other damage or danger, a dangerous situation that costs you even more money. And so I think the point that in the long run, it's wiser, smarter, better if you get the licensed architect at the beginning. Go through the process. It does cost more money to get permits for decks and electricians and all that than it does if you don't get them up front. But in the long run, the rules are the rules. Again, and this is how I started. We can change the rules if you don't want us to do this. Some we can't because they're state required. But this is about how we can work through the system together, understanding that the rules are there for a reason, and that you are usually better off spending a little bit more up front if you want to make those changes by doing it right. And everybody has these experiences where they're dealing with trying to build something in their home or make a change. And so there came a point when a gentleman named Sal Ferro came to me and said, listen, you're just killing this industry. We can't build here. We have 14 applications. He's the president of a company called Alure Contracting, and they were on TV, and they were on some of these TV shows where they build these beautiful houses for people. I actually asked them, how do you get these permits? So for that, in one episode, they come, it's like in a matter of hours. They show up, the person goes out for lunch, they come back, they have a brand new house. I said, how do you get permits and you build a house, and who are these guys building it? And he says it takes a little more longer time than seeing on TV. But a lot of times the governments love these guys coming in and they're making an improvement. They're fixing a problem that existed. Sal actually got stuck somewhere else. He couldn't get a flight back in time. And so Ron Benkin is going to be speaking on behalf of Sal and Alure and giving a contractor's perspective. Ron.
Thank you, Mr. King. We do build a house in that time frame, by the way. It's just the setup for the house and the permitting and so on that might take a little more time in the beginning. By the way, I go by odd vent delay, if that makes it easier. We were asked to talk about building in Suburbia, and Suburbia, to me, this Suburbia is very different than most Suburbias, as some of the panelists talked about. You know, we have Long Island we have New York City in our backyard, the greatest city in the world, and the wealth that comes from there, and that's been very good for us as a company. Tell you a little bit about us as a company. We're a remodeling company first and foremost. We do the construction and building, but more than 90% of our business is remodeling, renovations. And the permitting process has become much more a part of our business over the past few years. There's a lot more regulation, and we have a whole table here of people from our own company that's involved in somehow, one way or another, in the permitting process. So we're growing and learning and getting more involved in it. So we're a very unique Suburbia, and one of the things that makes us unique, and we've talked about a lot here, I think, is our diversity. The wonderful things about the diversity of Long Island and the type of personalities that you have, not only in the people, but even in the towns. You know, if you go from one area in Nassau County, the 5 towns, to the North Shore of Long Island, to the Hamptons, to Middle Suffolk, everyone has a very, very different personality. And that's what makes it wonderful to both work and to live here. But that diversity also has some negativity to it, and I think Tony discussed it pretty well, that we have, at my count, 308 different communities on Long Island. We have 2 cities, 3
towns in Mass.
There's 13 townships, I believe, in Long Island altogether, 93 incorporated villages, 195 hamlets. There's even 2 Indian reservations on Long Island. So that diversity is wonderful, but to try to do business there, especially as a remodeling contractor, with the amount of work that we do, amount of projects, we do over 1,000 bathrooms a year. And the expectations from each one of those is that, well, first of all, they have their own codes that they have to enforce, and they have their own interpretation sometimes of what the state code is, their own personalities, systems, and processes that you have to follow in doing business there. And then there's the time frames. There's a tremendous variation in time frames. You can walk into one building department in one part of Long Island, and at the end of the day walk away with a permit, and in another part of Long Island you might wait a year to get that same permit. So it makes it extremely difficult, and having the ability to get in front of a group of people like that, thank you for that, by the way, to share what our experience is like and some of the challenges, and I have to say that it's pretty clear that if you're building an extension on a home, or if you're building a new home, then of course you've got to go through this process, and it's pretty similar from one place to another. But when you renovate a bathroom or you renovate a kitchen, that's where the difference is so vast. So there's the time frames. The one thing that we found that's very, very constant from one building department to the next building department is their expectations that you're going to know exactly what's expected of you. And so it's challenging. The second challenge that we find I'd like to share with you is, now that we've grown, we started on Long Island, 65 years in business on Long Island, and in the last few years we've ventured outside of Long Island, and it gives us a nice perspective because we can kind of see how business is done in some other areas. And we do business in New Jersey. When I compare the two, an experience that I've had is when you speak to clients in New Jersey, very often that client, not very often, just about all the time, that client has an expectation that you're going to be filing for a permit. Okay, whether it's a bathroom, whether it's an extension, whatever it is, they expect that. And if you approach that client, if the contractor says to that client, you don't need a permit for this, or that client has to look at that contractor as being shady. Unfortunately, that's not what we experience on Long Island. Very often, we have to fight and we have to argue and convince the client why that's necessary, why we have to go through that process. And that's a challenge, and it's a challenge for all of us in the community. And I don't have all the answers, but what I can say to you is certainly what I'm hearing from North Hempstead, and hopefully we hear more and more of that throughout Long Island, easing of that process, making it so that when you've got a contractor that wants to do the right thing, you have a builder or contractor who wants to do the right thing, and follow the process and the systems and so on, file for permits to support that contractor. And what happens is sometimes we put the homeowners in a position where it's too difficult for them to follow that process, and they might speak for another contractor that sort of circumvents the process, maybe flies under the radar. And as the time frames grow and as it becomes more difficult to pull a permit, it makes that ethical contractor, it makes it more difficult to hire that ethical contractor, and the one that flies under the radar becomes much, much more attractive at that point. And then, of course, as it gets complicated even further with not only a permitting process, now you have to hire an architect and you need a full set of plans, and maybe you need a surveyor at that point, and it becomes too cumbersome, so you have to hire an expediter to go through that whole process. As you do that, again, that guy that flies under the radar becomes that much more attractive. And in effect, what we're doing is we're pushing the homeowner in a direction of trying to circumvent the system because it is just so cumbersome. So again, I don't have the answer to you, but the fact that we have all these different officials in here and that things seem to be moving in the right direction, I would just encourage everyone to, or hope that everyone sees it from the builder's point of view, from the contractor's point of view, and some of the challenges, not only in agreeing to go through the permit process, but having to fight or deal with homeowners that are asking us not to do that and possibly losing their business. In effect, what I'm saying is to be on an even playing field is where we're looking to be able to compete on quality, on service, on standing behind it, warranties, and so on, not on whether we're willing to take a risk and bypass the process. So I think I've gotten that point across pretty well. So as most people here said, I want to thank you, Mr. Kaiman. I want to thank everybody here for going in the right direction and helping us, and hope that other towns do the same. Thank you.